May 15th, 1929. A steam fitter arrives at the Cleveland Clinic early in the morning to repair a leaking steam pipe in the basement. It's routine maintenance, the kind of small job performed in hospitals every single day without incident. The basement he's working in also happens to be storing several tons of X-ray film, and that film is made from a material that, under the wrong conditions, doesn't just burn. It explodes, and it poisons everyone breathing the air around it. By the time the day is over, 123 people will be dead, and the way hospitals store hazardous materials will be permanently changed because of what happened in that basement. Picture a busy Wednesday morning at a respected medical clinic. Physicians moving between patient rooms, nurses managing a full schedule of appointments, the ordinary rhythm of a working hospital in full swing. Nobody upstairs has any reason to think about what's stored in the basement below them. That basement held an enormous quantity of nitrocellulose X-ray film, somewhere between 3 and 4 tons of it. Nitrocellulose, at the time the standard material for medical X-ray film, is extraordinarily unstable. It doesn't just catch fire easily. As it burns, it releases a thick, poisonous gas, primarily phosgene, the same toxic compound that had been used as a chemical weapon barely a decade earlier during the First World War. What made nitrocellulose so widely used despite its instability was simple. At the time, no safer alternative existed that could reliably capture the kind of detailed medical imaging physicians depended on. Hospitals across the country stored thousands of pounds of the material, typically with little more protection than ordinary fire safety measures designed for conventional combustible materials, measures that had never been tested against a fire-releasing toxic gas on this scale. The steam fitter's repair work exposed steam to material near that film storage, and within minutes, the nitrocellulose ignited. But unlike an ordinary fire, this one didn't simply produce smoke and flame. It produced a dense, yellowish-brown toxic cloud that began spreading rapidly through the building's corridors, climbing stairwells, seeping into rooms far from the basement where it had started. Unlike a conventional fire, where occupants can often see flames and smoke approaching and react accordingly, this gas spread with a kind of insidious quiet. Patients confined to beds on upper floors, unable to evacuate quickly on their own, had no advance warning beyond an unfamiliar smell drifting into rooms that, moments earlier, had seemed completely unaffected by whatever was happening several floors below them. A close, slow shot of a hospital corridor, harsh overhead lighting beginning to dim behind a thickening haze. Patients and staff, moments earlier going about an entirely ordinary day, now moving with mounting confusion and panic as a smell unlike anything they recognize begins filling the air around them. As the gas continued building inside the structure, it eventually triggered something almost unimaginable inside a hospital: explosions. Survivors and witnesses outside the building described hearing blasts so powerful they sounded, in the words of one witness, like a ton of dynamite detonating. The explosions blew out windows and sent debris, and horrifyingly, victims themselves outward from the building. Outside, the scene that greeted arriving emergency responders and bystanders was chaos. Bodies were found scattered across the lawn in front of the building, some of them victims who had attempted to escape through windows rather than risk the gas-filled corridors inside. Witnesses later described using porch furniture and settees pulled from neighboring buildings as makeshift stretchers, since there weren't nearly enough proper emergency stretchers on hand to manage a disaster of this scale. Among the responders who rushed toward the building rather than away from it was a Cleveland police officer named Ernest Staub. Moving in and out of the toxic, smoke-filled structure multiple times, Staub personally pulled 21 people to safety before the gas finally overwhelmed even him. He initially appeared to recover and return to ordinary duty in the days following the disaster. Witnesses who watched Staub's repeated trips into the building described a kind of grim, almost mechanical determination. Each time he emerged carrying or supporting another survivor, he turned immediately back toward the entrance, rather than pausing to recover his own breath. Colleagues later said he showed no outward hesitation, despite clearly knowing, by his 5th or 6th trip inside, exactly what kind of air he was breathing. Then, while working in his own front yard sometime later, he collapsed. A dim hospital room, an oxygen tent visible beside a bed, the slow, rhythmic hiss of equipment working to help a patient breathe air that for a brief period after the disaster had nearly killed him entirely. This is precisely the chilling detail that made the Cleveland Clinic disaster so uniquely terrifying compared to an ordinary fire. The gas didn't only kill in the moment. Some victims who initially appeared to survive relatively unharmed succumbed hours, or even days later. as the toxic exposure continued working through their bodies long after they'd been pulled clear of the smoke itself. Ernest Staub survived his collapse, recovering enough to continue serving with the Cleveland Police Department for another 25 years, working as a detective, but he reportedly carried ongoing health complications from his exposure for the rest of his life. The cost of going back into that building 21 separate times when nearly everyone else was trying to get out. The final death toll reached 123 people, patients, visitors, and hospital employees alike, including Dr. John Phillips, one of the Cleveland Clinic's own founding physicians, who died from the toxic gas exposure alongside the very patients and staff he had spent his career caring for. Investigators who examined the disaster afterward ultimately concluded that the Cleveland Clinic itself had not been negligent in causing the fire. The specific combination of factors that led the steam exposure to ignite the film had not been something any standard precaution at the time would have anticipated. Even so, the scale of loss made sweeping changes to hospital safety regulations all but inevitable. Lawsuits against the clinic following the disaster sought roughly $3 million in damages. Ultimately, these claims were settled out of court for a combined total of approximately $45,000, a sum that, even adjusted for the era, reflected just how limited legal accountability for institutional disasters still was at the time, regardless of how devastating the human cost had been. A wide, still shot of an old hospital building exterior at dusk, weathered brick, a small plaque near the entrance commemorating events from nearly a century earlier. Most people walking past it today have no idea what happened inside, or how directly it reshaped hospital safety standards they now take entirely for granted. In the disaster's aftermath, the city of Cleveland equipped its fire department with gas masks for the first time and established a dedicated municipal ambulance service specifically capable of responding to chemical emergencies. Nationally, the tragedy prompted medical facilities everywhere to develop entirely new standards for storing nitrocellulose film and other hazardous chemical materials, standards that, within a relatively short period, contributed directly to the eventual development of safer, non-flammable photographic and X-ray film materials across the entire medical industry. These changes extended well beyond Cleveland itself. Hospital administrators and fire safety officials across the country used the Cleveland Clinic disaster as a direct case study when revising their own facilities' hazardous materials protocols, recognizing that any hospital storing similar quantities of nitrocellulose film faced an identical, previously unrecognized risk sitting quietly in their own basements. What happened at the Cleveland Clinic in 1929 remains one of the deadliest disasters in American hospital history. Not caused by malice, not caused by obvious negligence, but by an ordinary repair job intersecting, by terrible chance, with a hazard nobody fully understood was sitting quietly in the basement the entire time. This has been a real, documented historical disaster. Every detail in this video is sourced from confirmed historical records and contemporary investigative reports. Dark Diagnosis Files investigates the horror that happens around hospitals and medicine. New cases every Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. Real, documented, told with the gravity they deserve. Subscribe. Your body is stranger than you think. The building still stands today, repurposed, surrounded by newer structures. A small plaque is the only thing that remembers what happened inside it.